Welcome to my notes on adding integers. So our objective today is going to be to add integers and come up with rules for adding positives to positives, negatives to negatives, and adding positives and negatives. So the first example we have here is 7 plus 6. So I'm going to go to my integer mat here. And I'm going to model 7 plus 6. So I'm going to put 7 of these squares over here. Okay, and I'm going to add 6 more squares. And as you can see here, all this problem is 7 plus 6. And what's 7 plus 6? That's correct, it's 13. So this is always going to happen when we add two positives, because when you add two positives, you just add them up and they're on the same sides. We just count them up. So now 9 plus 7 is 16. 7 plus 4 is 11. And 6 plus 4 is 10. So what's our rule here? What did we do? Well, we add and keep the answer positive. Okay, now we're going to look at what happens when we have a negative plus a negative. So you might already be thinking what might happen, but let's explore on the integer mat once again. So we're going to add negative 5 plus negative 8. So I already have 7 positives here, so I'm just going to move them to the negative side. 6, 7, and 8. And we're going to add 5 negatives to that. So what do you think negative 8 plus negative 5 is? If you were thinking just count them up, you're correct. And when you count them up, you find that there's how many? 13. And what side are they on? The negative side. So the correct answer is negative 13. So in our notes, fill out negative 13. And since when you add two negatives, they're always going to be on the same side, we can just count them up. So negative 9 plus negative 7 is negative 16. Negative 7 plus negative 6 is negative 13. And negative 6 plus negative 4 is negative 10. So once again, the rule is what? Add. But this time the answer is not going to be positive. It's going to be what? Negative. So add. Write this down and keep the answer negative. Okay, so now we've added positive and positive, negative and negative. And they're basically the same rule. We just add and we keep the sign the same. So positives, we keep positive, negatives, we keep negatives. Now we're going to look at some examples where we're adding some positives and some negatives. So let's take a look at our first example here. And it says 2 plus negative 5. So I'm going to go back to my integer, and we're going to do 2 plus negative 5. So I can keep those 5 negatives there. I'm going to put 2, whoops, let's see. We're going to put 2 positives over here. Let's see. 2 positives over here, and I'm going to take these off the screen. Okay, so now we have positive 2 plus negative 5. Now, they're not on the same side, so I can't just add them up. So what do you think I can do here? If you were thinking I can cancel out negatives and positives, you're correct. But in order to do that, I can do one from each side. So I'm going to take one positive and one negative away. And we call that a zero pair because together they make 0. And it's also called the additive inverse property when you add opposites. I have one more positive left, so I can take that and I can pair it up with one more negative. And so I made another 0 pair. And now we're left with what? 3 negatives. So my answer is negative 3. So let's go ahead and fill that in. And let's look at the next example. We have 5 plus negative 9. So go back to the integer. We have 5 plus negative 9. So I'm going to do the 5 first. And then I'm going to work on the negative 9 here. We already have 3 negatives, so I'm going to go 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So once again, I have a similar situation as before where I have negatives and positives. So I'm going to make 0 pairs until they all end up on one side. So I'm going to take away one negative and one positive, 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 and one negative and one positive. So once again, they all end up on one side, and how many do I have left? I have 4, and they're on the negative side, so the correct answer is negative 4. So I'm going to fill in negative 4. So let me fill this back in so you can see here. Now, what is a shortcut to what we just did? Or think about what we were doing to the blocks. We were canceling them out. So let's try to figure out how we came up with this 3. Do you know? If you were thinking subtract, you're correct. So subtract, but there's one other piece. How do we know whether it's going to be negative or positive? So if you look at both of these, you can see we have 5 negatives, 2 positives, 9 negatives, 5 positives. So I don't want to say the greater number because negative 5 is not greater than 2 and negative 9 is not greater than 5. So what I want to say is keep the sign of the most. So subtract and keep the sign of the most. In other words, this is the larger absolute value. So I'm going to put that in parentheses. Larger absolute value. Okay, now we're going to look at similar situation, only this time we're going to have a negative, then we're adding a positive. So the first situation we have here is negative 7 plus positive 5. So I'm going to go back to the mat here. And I want negative 7 plus positive 5. So there's my 7 negatives. And now I got to grab 5 positives here. Okay, now, once again, they're on opposite sides. We have negatives and positives, so I'm going to take away 1 from each side. So we're going to take away 1 negative and 1 positive. Once again, we are making what's called 0 pairs. So 1 negative, 1 positive, 1 negative, 1 positive. And this is also called the additive inverse property when I add opposites, and it equals 0. So all these equal 0. And now we're left with 2 what? Negatives, because we're on the negative side. So the correct answer is negative 2. So look at your notes and fill in -2. Now we have to do -3 plus 11. So back to the mat. So -3 plus 11. So I need 3 negatives here, and then I need to drag over 11 positives. Okay, and finally we have 11 positives there. Now, once again, we have negatives and positives that we're adding, so we're going to take away one from each side, making 0 pairs, until we've made all the 0 pairs that we can. And now we are left with how many? Hopefully you said 8, and since we're on the positive side, the answer is +8. So let's go back to the notes here. I'm going to fill in this answer again, -2, and we have +8 now. So let's think about the rule once again. What are we really doing to these two numbers? Hopefully you said subtract. Okay, 7 minus 5 is 2. We have more negatives, so it's -2. Now this one, 11 minus 3 is 8. We have more positives this time, so the answer is positive. So let's draw an arrow over here because it's the same exact rule. So when the signs are different, in other words, when we're adding negatives and positives, we're going to subtract and keep the sign of the most. Okay, that concludes our introductory notes to adding integers. I hope you have a great day.